Welcome to Night Talks, the University of Florida College of Journalism Communications talk show produced by the students for you. I'm Jake McTavish. I'm a freshman studying advertising. And our guest today is Amar Shah, a UF College of Journalism and Communications graduate who wrote and produced content for the NFL, the NBA, ESPN, and he is now an author publishing with Scholastic. Hi, Amar. Thank you for joining us.
Jake, it's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be here too with you. First question is, in 2003, you earned your bachelor's degree in the journalism from the CJC. How did this prepare you for your future career?
Wow, it seems like so long ago that I graduated, but it also seems just like yesterday. Graduating from UF laid the foundation for me as a storyteller, as a reporter, and as a journalist. During that time, I was a print journalism major, and then I switched over to online media because it was the brand new major that had just come out. And I knew we were at an interesting point in media and journalism that was changing. The whole landscape was, moving on into a world that I didn't know about. And so I wanted to make sure I was prepared. So I ended up switching from print to online my last year, and I learned how to do things from like coding to editing, and all of those different things laid the foundation for me for all my future opportunities that I learned here at UF.
You worked at ESPN from 2004 to 2007 as a writer, producer, and as a highlight producer. Later, you also worked there as a marketing rep and in content development. What did each of these roles entail?
So my first job out of school was sort of like a dream opportunity. I got into the production assistant trainee program at ESPN in Bristol. Yeah. And so that turned out to be graduate school for television production. When you get a chance to kind of work on a show like SportsCenter your second week into the job, and you're cutting a 30-second highlight, and you have to get that script and that video to the anchor in time, you learn how to breathe under pressure. And so after that, Bristol became a little too small for my wife and I as far as the things that we wanted to do, and I ended up getting an opportunity in LA to work in marketing for ESPN. It was a brand new world for me, but sometimes you make these diagonal jumps in your career that educate you in so many ways. And I worked in Disney and ESPN Media Network, so I worked in Burbank, California. And so that job really taught me how to work with different departments. And then my relationship with ESPN was always there, so even though I worked at different spots, I ended up going back to ESPN in 2011 and 2012, where I worked in content development. And so that was the group that did all the 30 for 30 series. And so it was really awesome to be in LA and working, in on the film side. And so I always continued that relationship with ESPN even afterwards, doing freelance work for them. And I got a chance to do everything from, doing documentary shorts about slam ball to creating baseball card shorts. So working for ESPN really cemented my ability to tell stories.
Yeah, it sounds like ESPN was like a really good foundation for that. Could you speak more on how you kind of got that jumpstart opportunity to work with them?
Yeah, so for me, after I graduated, I was like a lot of students, looking for that first job out of school. And so you're trying to utilize every opportunity that you have. And so I joined a group called the South Asian Journalists Association, SAJA, and I was able to go to their convention in New York, and this was back in like 2004. I met the director of diversity at ESPN, and I stayed in touch with her for about 5 or 6 months. And then luckily, I was able to land an interview. And so I flew over to Bristol. I did the interview, and somehow they used to do a thing called a sports quiz, and there were a particular group of people that would basically take you around ESPN, and little by little, they were interviewing you by asking you different questions about sports. Mm-hmm. And I ended up succeeding, and I got the job. And so, kind of getting in the door, that ended up creating an incredible network for me later on that I'm still in touch with to this day.
In 2009, you started Tamale Jar Production, serving as an executive producer. What types of clients and projects did you focus on?
in your career, nothing kind of goes, to a certain trajectory that you anticipate. And so I worked at a company called MySpace at the time, and unfortunately, I suffered. I went through the Great Recession, and my job was one of those that was lost. And so I didn't know what to do. It was the first time I've ever, was unemployed. But I think when you work in media, it's something that you have to go through. And my wife and I decided, you know what, we want to start something on our own. And so we started Tamale Jar Productions, and what we did in that production company was we created content for a slew of different companies that ranged from ESPN to doing work for creative agencies like a company called Octagon, and we ended up being their in-house agency. And so we worked with a variety of clients, and we did some really cool features. And I was really happy that we ended up doing our own thing. From an obstacle that we faced, we were able to thrive.
2012 was also the year you began working as a lead digital features editor/producer with the National Football League. How did you land that position, and what were some of the specific projects you had in hand?
No, that's a really great question. Working at the NFL was an absolute dream come true, but it was one of those things where I had the benefit of working in sports for a long period of time. And so one of the people that I mentioned before, Mark Brady, so someone who I worked with at ESPN, who was my boss, actually ended up working at the NFL. And so I saw a role there for a new position called the digital features editor. And so I applied for it, and I got the interview, and I interviewed with my future boss named Carmen Dukes, who was incredible, and I ended up landing the job. And so what that job was I was in charge of basically anything pop culture related when it came to the NFL. Our group kind of was in charge of. So it was almost like working at a brand new incubator at one of the biggest companies. We called it The Shield. And so I was like a kid in a sandbox. I got a chance to do so many different things, from writing my own fantasy football column to creating a platform called NFL Up, which was related to for fitness, to doing something where I kind of created the Varsity Blues oral history, to creating the casual fans guide to the Super Bowl. It was a dream come true. I got a chance to cover the NFL draft. I got a chance to go to the NFL Combine, where I really badly ran the 40-yard dash. I got to go to the Super Bowl and cover that. So it just ended up being an incredible opportunity for 4+ years where, like I said, I was living a dream job.
Yeah. I noticed in a lot of your work, in your entire timeline, a lot of it focuses on stuff with sports. What's the inherent interest in that field?
So I was a short, skinny kid growing up. I'm still short, not as skinny, but I have always loved sports more than anything growing up. And so getting a chance to continue that as a main vocation is something that I've absolutely loved. And I've always prided myself that I was one of the few kids that was on the cover of Sports Illustrated for Kids, the cover of ESPN, and on the cover of NFL.com, and I was a complete non-athlete.
Yeah, I mean, good achievement to have over your peers, right? Following your time with the Magic, you worked as a director of digital content for the Orlando Apollos. What was your biggest challenge in this role?
Oh, I absolutely loved my time with the Orlando Apollos, and anyone who has loved Steve Spurrier, this was a dream come true as a Florida Gator. Coach Spurrier was the head coach of the team, and so it was a brand new football league called the Alliance of American Football. And so, I took a chance, and I ended up becoming part of an organization that was started from scratch. So we had so many opportunities to try things, to experiment. And I've always thrived with a startup, whether it was at the NFL and starting, with that digital features group. The Orlando Apollos just allowed me to create something in my own vision, and I was given the freedom to create the entire strategy. And so I was able to hire my team. I was able to, we created documentaries, we created entire social media strategy, and it was just cool to kind of see something that didn't even exist and kind of build it up. We ended up having like the best team in the league, but and working with Coach Spurrier was incredible. He is an absolute genius, and getting a chance to see that up close and personal was like a dream. Was, like I said, I have lived many dreams, and that was one of the dreams. And unfortunately, the league didn't end up surviving, but I would do it all again in a heartbeat.
Across your whole career, do you have a most memorable interview or story you worked on?
Yeah, I have. I've been lucky enough to interview some of the most incredible people on the planet, from Michael Jordan to Buzz Aldrin. But one of the stories that I loved to tell and that still resonates with me was I got a chance to interview the famous actor Jon Voight for the oral history of Varsity Blues. Varsity Blues was a movie that came out in 1999. It was this big football movie, high school football movie about football in Texas. Starred James Vanderbeek and Scott Conn, Paul Walker, and a bunch of other actors. And so my job for the NFL was to basically tell how that movie was made. So I got a chance to interview all the different actors, the directors, and producers. But the one person that was still left was the coach. And Jon Voight, who's a famous actor, played that coach. And I chased Jon Voight down for 6 months. I called every number, and finally, I got a voicemail saying, "Hi, Amar, this is Jon Voight. I'm just returning your call." So I immediately called him back. And for about an hour, I had an interview that I did on my phone, and I had a recorder. And he talked to me. He was like the nicest guy, answered every single one of my questions. When I went back to check the interview, none of it recorded.
No.
And I didn't know what to do. And so I decided to call Mr. Voight back. So I called him back, and I didn't particularly tell him that the recording was lost. I was like, "Look, I have some other questions that I want to ask. Would you mind, spending?" He said, "Absolutely." So he ended up spending more time with me on that interview, and this time it recorded. And so it was one of those things where I ended up getting better content from the second interview, even though I botched the first one.
That's a really amazing story, and what I get from that is really the grit that you put into it too. I mean, losing the first interview and then having to do a second interview.
I think having that grit and persistence in your role as a journalist is so pivotal, as much as it is becoming as a storyteller, because I think what it shows you is you're going after the story. And that Varsity Blues project took me almost a year to put together, and so Voight ended up being that last interview, but it was worth it.
Currently, you're an executive producer of Studio T Creative. How does the creative team help its clients, and how did you navigate the dynamic of working alongside your wife?
So after the Orlando Magic, my wife and I had already started Tamale Jar Productions, but we wanted to kind of change the focus on that topic a little bit. And so we wanted to create almost a niche. Another thing I love, another phrase that I've always loved is there's always riches in the niches. And so, for us, we had a very particular niche, and that was animation. And so my wife also worked as a creative director, and so we decided to team up again and target that particular area of animation and utilizing it for different companies. So we put together an incredible team. We were able to get clients that ranged from like Golf Channel to ESPN to NHL teams, all the way to a baking company, the Fleischmann's Yeast, which is a famous baking product. We ended up creating their 150th anniversary video that ended up getting an Emmy nod. And so we were, it was really cool to be able to work with my wife and, create that team together. And so, there's always different things you have to deal with when you're dealing with your spouse. And so I think we both learned how to kind of deal with each other. And in some ways we're not really dealing with that right now. She's kind of doing her own thing, I'm doing my own thing. But I think Studio T for me is the next evolution of storytelling for us. Whether it's going to be documentaries or original IP, and kind of using that as being as a startup to creating our own production company 2.0.
Yeah, and I really do love the sayings that you're dropping, little hints of wisdom. Could you speak more on the saying you were just talking about?
Sure. In terms of riches and niches, I actually have to borrowed that from the director, Ava DuVernay, and I don't know if she had it, that's something she came up with, but I always looked at it as there are so many areas where you can find your particular expertise. You could be in, it's not just sports, it's not just basketball, but it could be a segment of basketball that you're the expert on. Or for example, the world that I'm in now, which is middle grade fiction. There's a lack of sports stories in that space. And I'm hoping that, my book can kind of take that niche and I can be, and I can kind of, extract some riches from it, because I really think there's opportunity in so many different areas. You just have to keep your mindset open to that possibility, and then it will definitely show itself.
A project you're currently working on is the Patel Motel story. Could you tell us more about this documentary?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I grew up, when I moved from New Jersey to DeLand, my dad bought a gas station. So I grew up as what I call a counter kid. So I'm a Gujarati Indian, and so a lot of Gujarat is a state in India where a lot of Indian Americans come from, especially ones with the last name Shah and Patel. So you either grew up in a gas station or you grew up in a motel. And so for me, even though I grew up in a gas station, my cousins and my friends all grew up in the world of motels, of econo lodges and travel lodges. And so as I grew up, this world became my universe. But it wasn't until years later when I realized that 60% of all of the hotels and motels in the United States are owned and operated by South Asians, in particular with the last name Patel. And so for me, that was one of the biggest entrepreneurial and immigrant stories of the last 50 years. They own, I think, around $350 billion worth of property. And so it's one of these like Americana stories that people just don't know about. And so I thought it would be the perfect area for me to find out, how did this happen and why did it become this way? And so the last 3 or 4 years, I've been working on the roots of how this story came about, and it's completely fascinating. It's about how 3 undocumented immigrants came over in the 30s and 40s to California to create this incredible hospitality empire. And so I've been working on the film for like the last 3 or 4 years, and we've shot from Dallas to California to Maryland, and we're continuing to film to this day.
Yeah, and 60% is a major statistic. What do you hope to do with this documentary when it's published?
The goal is to get distribution and to get it into a platform like Netflix or Amazon, and to get as many people to kind of see it. And so I think the characters in particular that we're interviewing are all incredible. They're all these amazing American entrepreneurs that started from scratch to create this amazing American dream.
Most recently, you're offering books published with Scholastic. Tell us about Wish I Was a Baller and the Play the Game trilogy.
So the next evolution for my career is one that I've wanted since I was a little kid, and that was to be a published author and novelist. And so when I was around 35, when my son was born in 2015, I wanted to write a novel. It's something I've always wanted to do, but I never had the discipline to do it. And so from age 35 to age 40, I wrote every morning and every night in between 9 to 5 jobs. And so in 2020, I ended up finishing my first book. And then a couple months later, right before I turned 40, I landed an agent a couple of months after. And so after that, you have to go through the process of submitting a book to different publishers. And so it reminded me of all these different industries that I worked in and how hard it was to break in. And so I ended up getting that book to an editor at Scholastic. And I got a call a couple months later from my agent saying that this editor was actually leaving. And so, but she had better news for me, and that was that his boss wanted to give me a 3-book deal based off of the novel that I had written in the sample pages that I provided for another project. So Scholastic gave me a 3-book deal to write a middle school basketball trilogy, which was something I've always wanted to do. As a young kid growing up in middle school, I never had any representation for me, as an Indian American or as a basketball player. And so to be able to create a character who was a version of myself and also a version of my son and daughter, and have it in Scholastic, which is the same publisher as J.K. Rowling, the same publisher as the author wrote Hunger Games. It was like a dream come true. And so that book series is out, and then I have another book coming out, which was actually based off the first novel I wrote called Wish I Was a Baller, which comes from the famous 95 Skee-Lo song, Wish I Was a Baller, which is a rap hip-hop track when I was a freshman. And so that is all about my friendship with Shaquille O'Neal back in the 90s, and also my role as the youngest writer for Slam magazine. So I got a chance to cover the NBA as a high school kid, and it's all about those years, being at the creme de la creme of getting a chance to interview Michael Jordan or Scottie Pippen and Penny Hardaway, along with being like a skinny, short high school kid who's trying to ask out the yearbook editor and who she's a senior. And so there's all this stuff that you deal with in high school with all of the dreams come true that come with it.
How do you infuse elements of Indian American culture into your work? And how do you strive to challenge stereotypes and promote nuanced representations?
So I think for me, one of the biggest stories I ever wrote was I wrote a Washington Post editorial about what it was like to be the son of Apu. My dad, as I said, was in the gas station business, and I never felt that his world was properly kind of introduced to America because I saw it as an everyday kid because this was my dad. And so it was incredible because these experiences growing up were never talked about. And so getting a platform to be able to tell these American stories is so important to us because we never had that growing up. And to be able to show representation, whether it's the Patel Motel story or whether it's the novels that I'm writing, I want to make sure that these experiences are universal experiences, that anyone can be able to access them. And so for me, whether it's like events like our traditions like Navratri or Diwali, to me those are American as Christmas or Easter. And so I'm sort of excited to show all of these different things that I grew up with, but also making them accessible for everybody else to understand.
Yeah, and I really think the work that you're doing is important. I mean, for earlier generations, there was just like flat examples, just like Apu, but in more recent years, you see all sorts of representations. So
yeah, I mean, what's been incredible over the last few years is the cosmopolitan experience that people are getting with not just like the Indian American experience, but also the South Asian American experience, whether it's Marvel shows or whether it's Sundance filmmaking or whether it's narrative fiction. There's just so many varieties of storytelling that people are finally getting their opportunity to tell their story.
At one point, you were a content producer for the platform MySpace. How is digital media evolving since the 2000s? And where do you foresee the digital content heading in the near future?
Wow, MySpace, that brings back some really fun memories. So I worked at MySpace in the late 2000s, aughts, I guess they call them, 2008, 2009. And MySpace was the most popular website at the time. It was bigger than Facebook even. But it was kind of like being at the party until like it got broken up, and that's what it was like during the Great Recession. Everyone had a MySpace page. You can go back and watch Adam Sandler movies where he's talking about MySpace Tom and being at MySpace. But what happens is every few years, there's a new platform that comes in and kind of changes the ballgame, whether it was MySpace or whether it was Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. It all evolves. And I think that's the only thing that you can be certain of is change, and that these platforms are going to morph in terms of where they're located and how people use them. And so the only thing that remains constant is how do you use those to create storytelling. And I think, whether it's a 15-second video or an hour-long documentary, you're always going to have to know the art of storytelling. And I think that's never going to change. And the way that I see it constantly evolving and changing is, like right now you have AI, and AI is going to be a game changer if it hasn't been already. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see so many different genres morph together and change that you constantly have to be on the next shift as far as where it's going. Nobody knows. No one has a glass to kind of see where the future is headed. But the only thing you know is that it's going to change. But you just have to be in the mind frame or have a frame of mind to know that these things are coming, and how do you adapt your skill sets to that platform?
You gain skills that are applied to positions that don't even exist right now. You've seen that in your own personal experience.
Yeah, I mean, I look back in my years at UF, and these were the nascent days of video editing, of like Adobe Premiere, of learning HTML, and I didn't know that. I kind of knew, but I didn't know how I would use those things growing up in my career, and I ended up using those at different times. But I also know that it's constantly reinvesting in yourself and making sure that you're picking up skill sets. But also the biggest skill set of that is having the mindset to know that things are going to be changing and giving yourself the opportunity to change with those times. And I think that's why it's so important to always invest in your own education and in your own self versus anything else.
Yeah. There's a lot of common traits I see: adaptability, grit. Would you add anything to that list?
Yeah, I think you have to have an outlandish belief in yourself. And I think it's important to be self-confident. You don't have to be arrogant, but you have to have this belief in your vision. And I always kind of like to use the moonshot analogy that, you're trying to get to the moon, and you're going to build all this infrastructure to get there, that even if you may not get there the first time, you never know what technology or what kind of cool things you're building along the way. So it's this amazing journey that we're all taking to get to where we want to be. And it's also having the ability to learn how to pivot and to know that the world doesn't go, a straight narrative. It's always going to shift, but understanding that you're eventually going to get to the place you want to be. You just may not get there at the exact moment you want to be at.
Yeah, like you said, you get successes at different times. You started off at the jump of something, but then you see achievement in a different field in your 40s.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know that my vocation would change from like producer to author and novelist, but it's one of those things. I think with each season of your life, as long as you're open to know that, hey, this isn't coming right now, but this will eventually arrive. My 40s have been an incredible opportunity for me to see where dreams that I had when I was a kid are coming true. And so I wouldn't have it any other way.
Thank you for your insight, Amar. I feel like we went over a lot today, from having this outlandish belief in yourself that's important to have, to grit, and so many other insights that it doesn't really matter what your form of job might be, whether it be media or something else entirely. Thank you to our viewers for joining us tonight, and until next time, good night and go Gators.